microphone? Can you hear me? Do I need microphone at the back? I'm actually delighted to be here. You know, it's interesting. I spent most of my life working as a bookseller. And as a bookseller, you learn to appreciate how important booksellers really are, because it's booksellers who help make books. And when the first of this series appeared, when The Alchemist appeared 4 years ago, 2007, one of the first shops I stopped in was here. And you were one of the first booksellers to support me. So I'm always delighted to come back. And thank you all for coming out. As a bookseller, you learn the dangers of setting up a signing. Because often no one turns up at all. And the story I tell is, when I was a bookseller back in Ireland, I once had a very, very famous author, actor, who had just written the first volume of his biography. It was a very scandalous biography. And he was doing one event in Ireland, and he was doing it in my bookstore. And I did a week of advertising in the press. He was on the Late Show the night before, and he said, and I'm signing tomorrow morning at 12 o'clock, 12:30. And nobody turned up. Not a single person. I eventually ended up sending the staff out one door with their coats on to come in another door and just buy books from them. So I'm hoping some of you don't work here for politics. So thank you for coming out. I'm only doing one event in the Washington area. I'm here to see the Boy Scouts tomorrow, me and 45,000 Boy Scouts. It should be quite fun. Who chooses an event in July in Virginia on an army base with mosquitoes as big as your head? So I'm not sure I'm looking forward to it, but it'll be different and interesting, that's for sure. It'll be fun. So I'm here for the Necromancer, and when I set out to do this series, I never sort of imagined this stage where suddenly I'm more than halfway through. I'm currently writing The Warlock and the Enchantress, which are the last two parts, and I'm writing those together because it's sort of one big story. And suddenly I can see the end in sight. And before I set out to do this series, I spent about a decade actually doing the research to get it right. And you know, it was interesting, the synopsis which I originally wrote 10 years ago is still more or less complete. It's changed a wee bit. The Necromancer was the book where it changed the most. But the ending, the ultimate ending, remains the same. It remains untouched. I haven't messed with that too much. So I do know the ending. And I had to know this series really well. I knew, and I've told the story before, how I discovered Nicolas Flamel's house in Paris. And it's a real house. It's now a wee restaurant called the Auberge Nicolas Flamel. And what's really bizarre and terribly odd to me, that if you now go to this restaurant, what you'll find in the window is a copy of The Alchemist. And in fact, if you go onto Wikipedia and look at the photograph of the Auberge Nicolas Flamel, just in the right-hand corner, you'll see the photograph of my book. So the book has come full circle. Because it was in Nicolas Flamel's house that I finally got the idea to use Nicolas Flamel. Flamel was never the hero of this series. It was always going to be Dr. John Dee. He was always the hero. I'd written about Dr. John Dee before. He is an extraordinary man. I mean, I've always said, in the Elizabethan age, which was the age of amazing things, he was extraordinary. He was Queen Elizabeth I's magician, mathematician, astronomer, astrologer. He chose the date for her coronation, and we have the letter that he wrote to her saying, you can have this date, you will have a short life, and marry and have children. Or you can have this date, you will never marry and never have children, but you'll have one of the longest reigns of any British monarch. And she chooses the second date. And he was Elizabeth's spy. He spied for Sir Francis Walsingham travelling when he travelled all across Europe. And when he would send back his coded messages, his messages coded, signed by him, he would sign them with two O's that looked like eyes, because he was the eyes of the Queen, and a slash that looks like a 7. He was the original 007. So when Ian Fleming came to give James Bond a call sign, that's where it comes from. So Dee was my hero. The problem with Dee is that he was always a little bit dark and a little bit sinister. And certainly towards the end of his life, he went completely off the rails. He fell in with an Irish rogue called Edward Kelly. So you must never trust Irish people. And Edward Kelly took him for just about everything he could find. Edward Kelly, and he should have known, because Edward Kelly had had his ears clipped as a punishment because he had been a forger. So this guy, Edward Kelly, turns up to John Dee and says, I can do all this great stuff. And Dee, who didn't look at his clipped ears and think, maybe there's something wrong here, took him at his face value. And he fell in with Dee, and the two of them fell in with Dee. And so towards the end of his life, he was a little bit odd. But Dee was my hero. And then I discovered Flamel's house. And sitting in Flamel's house, which is a restaurant, having a cup of tea, looking around this amazing room, which hasn't changed a whole lot in the past 600 years, I remembered what the little I knew about Nicolas Flamel. Nicolas Flamel was a bookseller, and I was a bookseller. And I've always loved the idea of making a bookseller a hero, because booksellers don't get the press they deserve. And one day he buys a book, written in a language which he cannot understand. He spends 20 years translating this book, traveling all across Europe. And although he left Paris as a penniless bookseller, when he returns 20 years later with Paranel, his wife, he is fabulously wealthy. And Paranel, who is 10 years older than Flamel, makes him set up schools and hospitals and churches, and some of those still exist in Paris today. There is the Rue Flamel, just around the corner from the Rue Paranel. That's how important they were in Paris. He's been used a couple of times in fiction, and I'm sure all of you know that Miss Rowling used him in the Harry Potter books, and I still get emails from people saying, did you steal Nicolas Flamel from Harry Potter? Or did you get permission from J.K. Rowling to use? And the answer is no, because he is a real man. Every single character in this series is drawn out of history, and all of the creatures are drawn out of mythology. So what I did, sitting in that wee restaurant, was I changed the hero. I made him Flamel rather than D, and that worked tremendously well, because there's a great legend about Nicolas Flamel. When Nicolas Flamel dies, first of all, Paranel dies, and then Flamel dies. And when he dies, his house is ransacked, because he was fabulously wealthy. And there's no money in the house, there's no furniture, the house is deserted, the house is empty. So then his grave is broken into, and his grave is dug up, and his grave is empty. And then they dig up Paranel's grave, and it too is empty. And then about 4 years later, Nicolas and Paranel are spotted in Paris. And then they're spotted in Rome, and then they're spotted in Berlin. And the story is, of course, that they had discovered the two great secrets of alchemy: how to turn base metal into gold, and how to become immortal. And from a writer's perspective, that's just a gift, an absolute gift. So I had my hero, and I just shifted Flamel, I shifted D into being the villain, and he works perfectly as the villain. Then I created the synopsis, and as I wrote the synopsis for this series, because I'd always wanted to use mythology in the series, I saw that there were 6 very niche breaks in the story, and that gave me my 6 books. And then I went in and I plotted each book individually, right down to chapter by chapter level, because I was about to begin on like a 6-year journey, and I knew I was going to get lost halfway through. I knew I needed certain things, and because most of you have read The Necromancer, I can talk about it quite openly. Because often, remember, when I'm touring for a book, I'm writing the next one, and people are usually reading the book previous, so I have to be careful not to reveal too much. I knew I needed certain things. I needed a heroine in France, and I cannot write about France without writing about Joan of Arc. So she was always there from the beginning. I needed a bodyguard for Sophie and Josh for the early parts of the books. So Skafak appears. I've always wanted to do something with Skafak, the Celtic warrior, and Aoife, her sister. So the characters began to, because I needed certain things for the story, the characters began to suggest themselves. And then I came across Niccolo Machiavelli. Always wanted to do something with Machiavelli. He's such an interesting man. And he's sort of a counterpoint to D, whereas D is dark and sinister and a baddie, maybe. Machiavelli is not quite so dark, not quite so sinister, but much more dangerous, and a baddie, maybe. Because no one really knows with this series, except me, I know. And so I began to use the character of Niccolo Machiavelli. And I needed to give him a foil. So when he came to America, he had someone to play off against. And I wanted to use someone out of the Old West. Now the Old West really lasted for about 10 minutes, that's all. And out of that we get this huge body of American mythology. And I came down to 2 choices. It was Billy the Kid or Jesse James. And Billy the Kid was always much more interesting because he's the much more tragic character. Jesse James is just too much of a villain. And I put Billy and Machiavelli together. I get more emails. I used to get a lot of emails for Skafak. She was often the #1 character. Now I get more emails from Billy, about Billy and Machiavelli than any other characters, and people love them. They really love them. So what you have is this incredibly urbane, beautifully dressed, elegant, Italian, immortal. And you get Billy the Kid, who is none of those things. And they're the perfect foil. And in fact, Someone said to me recently, would you consider doing a book with just the pair of them as heroes? And the answer is probably, you know. So what I'll do for you this evening is I won't read you a Flamel chapter or a D chapter. I'm going to read you a Billy the Kid chapter because they're such fun to do. And then you can get to ask me all those hard questions.